Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
Vanessa, do you ever find yourself wondering or frankly fielding questions about legal issues that you just don't even know what the answer is? And it has to do with adolescence and puberty and brain development, decision making and tech and all the things we talk about. But you're stuck trying to find the answer for the person. And you literally start going down a rabbit hole online and you cannot find the answer.
Yeah, I mean, this landscape is so confusing, particularly as it relates to tech and social media and consent, because often the laws vary state by state. Age of consent is different in different states, and there's different case law and precedent in different states. And I think we spend a lot of time, importantly, talking about how to have conversations and guidance and advice, but the legal side of things is important and really complicated.
Right. And we get questions, whether it's from kids in our own house, our kids' friends, or people who DM us or email us. We get questions about how to handle scenarios that have a legal component, right? Two people are dating and one is under the age of consent, for instance. And I pause because that is different from state to state, and what you can consent to and where and how is different. It's so layered and complicated. So today we have Caitlin Andrews on the podcast. Caitlin is a family lawyer and an educator from the School's Consent Project. And what she does is she takes her 15 years of history as an attorney for children in family court in New York, and she applies it to helping both kids and their parents and trusted adults understand what is and is not legal about all of these questions that swirl around, whether it's general tech use, specifically social media use, sending nudes, revenge porn, like all the things that can keep you up at night. She helps tease them apart.
And what's so important about the work that Caitlin does is she hears the questions that kids are asking. And they ask really complicated questions that get into all sorts of layers in terms of law and precedents. And it's really fascinating to hear what kids are asking her. So we understand their starting point, we understand what they're worried about, and we understand what they're being exposed to. This episode blew our minds. It's incredibly fascinating. And you can check out School's Consent Project at the link in our show notes to learn more about the work that they're doing.
And we'll put all of the resources that Caitlin mentions on the Resources We Love page on lessawkward.com.
Hi, Caitlin. How are you?
Hi, I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
We're so happy to have you here. Shout out to Grace Bastidas, who is the editor-in-chief of Parents Magazine, or I guess it's just called Parents now, for connecting us. There's nothing like going online and talking about porn to really bring you new friends and new collaborators. The minute I started talking about porn, Grace was like, I have someone you need to meet. And I was like, okay, this could end well or badly. Luckily, in our case, it ended really, really well. Caitlin, will you just share a little bit for our listeners about your background and what you do in educating kids about consent with the School's Consent Project?
Yes. So the School's Consent Project is a London-based charity. We just got started in New York last school year. So we're just wrapping up our second school year. What we do is we train lawyers and we bring them into classrooms to talk to kids about consent. We're talking to kids from middle school to high school. We talk about consent generally. We talk also about it all from a legal lens. So we talk about felony rape in the first, the crime of sex abuse. And we also do a lot of work around sexting. That's something that the schools, teachers, kids have asked about. And so we have an entire workshop on that right now. We also do parent workshops. We also do teacher workshops as well. And my background before I came to the Schools Consent Project, I was a lawyer for kids at the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn. And so I represented kids in family court when their families had ACS cases. So I represented babies up till kids in their 20s when they were leaving foster care, kids who also got arrested. So my background is definitely in explaining hard legal concepts to kids.
And for those of you not in New York, ACS is Administration for Children's Services. There's different acronyms in different states around the country. And for those of us who spent time in New York and in family court in New York, it's a really complicated and important place in our legal system, and really very little known about it unless you have been a family or a kid within that system. So Caitlin, we're going to have you focus today. I mean, you just mentioned a series of really important topics, but we're going to have you focus today about sexting, but in a broader way, social media use, tech use, and the law when it comes to kids. Because, Cara, I don't know about you, but sometimes I'll say things to my kids and I'm like, I'm not sure that's legally true, but I'm using this to convince them.
That's it. You know, we did an episode with Jonathan Crystal a couple of years ago, walking through what they don't teach you and what the law is, but we have not yet really looked through the lens of kind of the intersection of tech, social media, and sort of rights, true, false, legal, illegal, and the evolving landscape and how you stay on top of it. So let's start there. Like, Caitlin, let's paint the broadest brushstroke possible at the top. What, in your opinion, are the biggest challenges facing kids when it comes to tech? And then we'll dive into them.
I mean, I think you kind of just touched on it. It's that the law and technology are changing so quickly, and the adults in charge of all the decision-making power have far less facility with tech than the kids do. And so, you know, we talk about prosecutorial discretion. We talk about police, prosecutors, judges, and juries making these determinations. And a lot of them don't have the updated understanding of how kids just live their everyday lives. We've heard sexting described as like first or second base. And I think for a lot of the adults in the decision-making power, they don't have the same comfort.
Yeah. So will you give an example of something where there's just a misfire or a disconnect that creates its own set of problems?
Yeah, I think sending explicit images generally, like there was a kid recently in family court who was arrested, a 17-year-old who was arrested because a 16-year-old girlfriend said that she sent him images and he sent them out. No one that was in charge of the case knew what to do with that case. No one knew, what exactly services would be beneficial for the family. The family was asking for services to come in and help this kid. The girl also distributed explicit images. There was no consequences for her. And, I don't know that all the details of the case, but I think that everyone is kind of figuring it out on the fly. And in the middle of that, there's both, likely a kid who had images sent out and a kid who is arrested for felony charges.
Okay, so I love this example, and let's stick with it and go a little deeper, because there's also a third leg of the stool. Usually there's a third leg of the stool, which is school, right? These kids often go to school together, or that is a place where images are distributed or a group to whom. So let's say you've got this situation in your life. Maybe I don't know if you want to pick that the child who's done the sending out is your child, the child who's been sextorted is your child's just in the school, in the peer group. But can you go down that rabbit hole a little bit and talk about how you teach kids in particular, and also adults, what their rights are, what the law is? Like, how do people figure this out? This happens every day.
Yeah. Yeah. So the way that we define it, so when we're talking about any sort of law, we break it down into elements. And so the way that we break down, especially child pornography, we break it down into take, ask for, possess, or distribute an image or video of an explicit image or genitals of someone under 18. And so that's kind of just like a conglomeration of a bunch of different laws put together. And it certainly has more of a New York State focus, but there's also federal law. And I think it's pretty applicable for many states to have that general definition. And then another way that we talk about this is with the idea of prosecutorial discretion. So police officers are going to have to make the decision about whether they're going to make an arrest. A prosecutor is going to have to make a decision about whether they're going to take a case. And then a judge is going to make a bunch of decisions down the line. And so starting with that kind of legal background, we can examine how every single case is going to be different, right? Every single school is going to have different policies for this. We know schools full of mandated reporters, and there could be an obligation for them to report something up to a children's services agency or to the police. And, getting caught in all of that is really tricky. And I think the law also is designed thinking about, as far as how we think about it, like a harm reduction model. The law cares much more about people sending explicit images outside of a relationship than it does between two people sending them inside a relationship.
And Caitlin, we know that based on precedent. Is that, or is it explicitly stated in any of the laws?
So there's a really great case that came out of Brooklyn Criminal Court last year that really broke that down. You might think that there would be a lot of case law and precedent on this, but there is not. And I think that's because when kids get arrested for this, their lawyers are not taking these cases to trial. It is really scary to be on the forefront of this. And that's what I say to the kids in class. Like, you are really on the forefront of changing law and technology. And as like a defense attorney, it's a scary place to be. And so, we want people kids to be a little bit more mindful about who they're sending it out to, mindful of whether they have it or not, and if they're keeping it. Like, we had a kid ask, okay, so my girlfriend sent me pictures that we broke up. I should probably delete them after we break up. And I was like, that's a great idea. That's a really good thing to kind of think about.
I just want to be super explicit, though. Based on the definition you offered, which is an amalgamation of a variety of laws, if a kid is under the age of consent and either sends, receives, or is in the possession of explicit images, and we should define actually explicit images or images of genitalia, that is considered child pornography. Is that correct, Caitlin?
Yes.
And also what you said was, it is now sort of the standard to be expected that there is no standard, that every school will because this is the part that makes people want to lose their mind.
Right. But I want to make sure, Cara, when I've said to my kids, hey, no sending nudes, no asking for nudes, no keeping nudes, that is child pornography, that I'm not actually full of shit,
100%,
that it is legally considered child pornography. We're going to get to the next layer and next layer. I just want to make sure I'm not a liar.
Yes, no, that's fabulous. You're not a liar. But I think the issue is their natural follow-along question is, what could happen to me? What are the consequences?
Right.
And I think this is where it gets really muddy and really confusing.
So, Caitlin, you talked about the discretion of the police, the discretion of the prosecutor, the discretion of the judge, the discretion of the school. And, we are human beings and they are human beings making choices about other human beings who aren't just human beings, they're children, right? They are still under development in every way possible. So that's on the one side of things. On the other side of things, you have the norms. You have the cultural norms of what kids are doing and sending and sharing on a regular basis, which is, even though the world is telling them, or maybe not telling them, hey, this is child porn, they're still sending, requesting, keeping explicit images. So before we examine that sort of seesaw of complication, can you define what explicit images are?
So That is also not completely figured out. One of the laws in New York State defines female nipple as an explicit image, but not male nipple. There's no mention of anything having to do with trans children or trans people. If I've had a kid ask me, okay, well, I have a naked picture of my 2-year-old sister in the bath and she's so cute, is that going to be an explicit image? And that's not what the law is designed to be worried about. The law is designed to worry about explicit images of sexual acts in progress, videos of that in progress, and genitalia. And so that is still being figured out as far as, case law. I haven't read any kind of borderline cases about that have gone to trial.
I mean, as a pediatrician, the number of pictures that I received when I was seeing kids in the office that if they were sent by someone else under different circumstances would qualify, but I think are defensible, but I still generally told parents not to send them for all the reasons, right? But so it's the circumstances, right? As much as the images.
It is. And it's funny. Like I've had entire cases that kind of hinge on photos of a diaper rash that were sent to people and whether that end up being an explicit image in my old job. It does depend on the circumstance and it does depend on a lot of different factors. And it's really going to be all of those people who have the decision-making power determining that.
So knowing, Caitlin, that we are left in a situation where there's so much, it depends, right, on all of the factors. How do we talk about it with kids? I mean, I'd love to hear how you all talk about it in schools, in classrooms, because it's a really tricky spot for school communities. And then also, piggybacking on that, how do we as parents and caregivers talk about it in our own family? So let's start with what you notice and experience when you all are in schools meeting with students and faculty.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that I think is interesting is just there's a general commodification of girls' bodies that is kind of obviously part of the larger society that we live in. We get questions all the time about, well, what if my son just sends it out because it's funny? I'm like, well, is that going to be funny for the person on the other end? And so there's definitely a lot of misunderstandings about that I think really do go with larger societal issues about how we treat girls and women in this society. Very interesting to me to hear directly from kids questions about this because they are questions that none of us would have asked 10 years ago. I had a girl ask me, okay, well, what if I'm texting with a bot and the bot asks for a picture and I send the bot a picture and then I find out that the bot is part of a bot farm overseas. Can that maker of the bot farm be extradited? And I was like, wow. These kids have just so much on their minds. And so much of this really is just part of a regular relationship. And so the way that we talk about it, it's never wise to say to teenagers, don't do something, as you guys all know, and you talk about all the time. So we just really try to make sure that they know what the baseline is and make sure that they are talking to each other and acting with each other in a really respectful manner around these things. We find so often in our conversations that these are not conversations these kids are having with each other, and being able to have a conversation in school where people, and I don't mean to generalize, but boys and young men get to listen to girls and young women about what their expectations are in relationships. And I think even just giving them that space is really helpful.
So, Caitlin, let's put a bow around, or let's just try to encapsulate a little of what you just said as we move into a little bit more about consent and sextortion. I think it's important to look at the female experience versus the male experience. I'm curious to understand from you if the law is able to not see this as a zero-sum game, because we are doing increasingly better, I think, both legally and socially, at recognizing the female experience and the need for females to be protected, the need for females to find voice. But sometimes I feel like that becomes a zero-sum game, and there are many needs for our developing boys that kind of lost or sidelined. How do you grapple with that? How does the law see that? And what can we do as the parents and trusted adults who love these kids to make the playing field a little more level so that everyone's needs are met?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. That's like a very thoughtful question. I mean, I think being able to just have these open and honest conversations is a great start to be able to really outline for the kids what their roles and responsibilities are to each other. We get asked increasingly this year about false allegations. And, that's not a real thing. Of course, it happens. There's always going to be a small percentage of people that lie about being the victim of any sort of crime. But there is really zero evidence that happens disproportionately in crimes of sexual violence. We know those are underreported at every single level, but there is a real concern that I hear from boys and from girls that there are girls making up these allegations for attention all the time. And it's been very interesting to hear that addressed. And I ask kids to take a moment and think of any man who has been incredibly accused of sexual violence and if they're in a position of power or not. And we know that really doesn't have the same kind of lifelong effects that maybe we're worried it does.
Right. I mean, when I've had this conversation with young men and teen boys, I will say to them, hey, do you know what the mental health and physical health impacts are of having been the victim of sexual violence? And they're kind of like, no, it's like really awkward and tough. And when I start to cite to them the downstream mental health challenges, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, all of those things, not to mention fear of intimacy, all of those things. And they recognize that, like, why would anyone really want to do that? Like, why would you want to put yourself in this situation if it wasn't true? Because it's so devastating for years and decades after the fact. And I think, Caitlin, to your point, it gets at the larger issue of opening up conversations that don't normally happen, right? There are these tropes, which sadly are often rooted in misogyny and really discrediting women. But more than that, there's all sorts of conversations we're not having with boys about intimacy and vulnerability and communication and love. And so to Kara's point, it's like, yeah, we got to talk about the sexual violence. We also have to, as you said earlier, help open the door to conversation about what do we expect in relationships and what do we want from them. And as we write our high school curriculum, our health and sex ed curriculum, and we're working with Shafia Zaloom, who swims in these waters all day, every day, and we think about how do we talk to high school kids about these topics, it's so fascinating because they actually want to talk about this stuff. They do actually want to talk about love. They do want to figure out what picture do they want to receive from me? What texts are actually get me deeper into my relationship in a way I won't? And what texts are like going to turn somebody off? Like, they want to know about it, but because everybody's doing it secretly and behind, closed doors, literally, no one's talking to them about it. And I think having these conversations, including how typical it is for kids to sext and for kids to send explicit images, is stuff we have to get out into the open.
This also reminds me, there's a consent conference at Georgetown Day School in Washington, D.C. in November. And I went this year and I sat in on a discussion with Boys Leading Boys, which is a program that brings boys to talk to other boys about these issues. And I was the only female presenting person in the room. I felt like I had stepped through some sort of portal. It was incredible. And one thing that they spoke about was how they don't see examples in media of how to have these conversations. And I was like, oh my God, you guys need to watch rom-coms. You guys need to read romance novels. Like, there's a whole world out there of media that is designed for girls and women that reflect girls' expectations, and just dipping your toe into it. Nobody needs to see that you bought the book. No one needs to.
That's fascinating.
I make my boys watch rom-coms with me. And they sort of protest, and then they enjoy them. And I think partially because it gives them insights into, the universe. I mean, also some of them are like 90s rom-coms, or it's like Pride and Prejudice with Keira Knightley. So I'm not saying they're necessarily like current, but it gives them permission to receive and ingest that content in a way the world is telling them, if they're, cis hetero guys, like, oh, this isn't for you. You're not supposed to be watching or reading this.
But I mean, it's such a good piece of advice from someone who is in court, someone who is in schools teaching kids and their parents the law. Here is a very simple recommendation. Go educate yourself on what another person might find attractive, right? Go look at the story of the dream scenario, and it plays out on every single streamer 24/7 in the rom-com category. I mean, it's like so simple, right? It's so simple. Also, there are a lot of movies that do not give great advice, and I'm sure we could go down that lane.
Yeah, they were the movies that we watched as
all of them.
Young people, which were the opposite of. But like perfect example is To All the Boys I've Loved Before, the first one where the main character is making out with a guy and somebody films it and posts it on Instagram. And it's a perfect example of this happening and what the downstream effects are and how to handle it and all of that. It doesn't even have to be that explicit in terms of a social media related scenario. But Caitlin, what are some other examples that come up with the kids in the workshops that you lead? I mean, sexting, for example, is, so common.
Standard.
And so I'm wondering, like, what are some other things that come up when you work with kids?
Yeah. So first of all, I cited To All the Boys I've Loved Before as a perfect example in that workshop. I love that. None of them had seen it. They told me it was a generational thing. I said, dude, it came out 5 years ago. It's not a generational thing.
Micro generations, apparently.
Yeah. So one great question that I so many questions, but one that I thought was really compelling. So the age of consent in New York State is 17. Every state has different ages of consent, but New York is strict liability. The age is what the age is. The age of consent in New York is 17, but the explicit images, it's 18. So I had a 17-year-old girl in a class say, okay, I'm 17, my boyfriend's 19. I send him a video of us having sex and I ask him to post on OnlyFans. Could he get in trouble? Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. That, even though you are of the age of consent to be able to consent to have sex, you are not of the age of consent to be able to send those images.
Caitlin, everything about that question has my mind spinning, and I think we'll have our listeners spinning. But I think it's a really important moment to press pause and just acknowledge that question is not an outlier question for you, right?
And can you define what OnlyFans is for the uninitiated?
Sure. So OnlyFans is a site for, as I understand it, basically like homemade pornography. And it's also a site where people
user-generated content, Caitlin.
User-generated content. Thank you. Way better.
DIY porn.
Thank you. Gosh, it's our first real mention of porn. We have so much more to say about it.
Oh, don't worry, Caitlin. We'll get there.
Yeah. So, it is a way certainly for people to earn an income. And so
it's monetized. This is not free porn. So OnlyFans is behind a paywall, and it's not like free Pornhub sites. It is paid. And as you say, they, people can make a lot of money off of OnlyFans, present company excluded. And kids, Caitlin, can you describe the ways in which OnlyFans is sort of common parlance amongst teens and young people?
It's not common parlance to me via these kids. Really, they're, they definitely, we talk about porn a little bit. We talk about that, a little bit, but that has not come up a lot.
So I can step in and say the ways in which it comes up in the circles I'm in, which is that there are influencers who have joined OnlyFans or became influencers via OnlyFans. And so they are part of the larger pop culture zeitgeist. And so that our kids, essentially, it's like the celebritization of porn stars when we were growing up, right? Like we knew about Ron Jeremy, which is, for those of you, look him up because I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But needless to say, it a very large mustache. And I'm not using that as a euphemism. But for our cars under her desk. But for our kids, the collision of pop culture and pornography happens in a variety of places, but OnlyFans. So, for example, I heard from a teenage boy who was like, hey, I think you should do an episode about the OnlyFans star who had sex with 1,000 men in one day. And I was like, okay, let me learn a little more about that. Tell me more about what you heard. And it's like the way we talked about hey, I saw a magazine picture of George Clooney at Whole Foods in LA. That's how we would have talked about it 20 years ago. Now it's, hey, this OnlyFans star had sex with 1,000 people in one day, right? So it becomes just it's just in the water they're swimming in. But Caitlin, porn in general, can you just spend a minute talking about how pervasive that is in their realities?
Yeah. So I think it's impossible to talk about sex and consent without talking about pornography. We address it a little bit with our students. It's something that I'm, considering how to kind of broaden. And the way that we also talk about it with our parents. So at the School's Consent Project, we do workshops with kids and also with parents. And so the way I talk about it with parents is that porn is a business and porn is designed for you to pay for porn. And so the images that you're getting are going to be more hardcore because the people who like the hardcore stuff are going to pay more for the hardcore stuff. And I talk about this a little bit with kids too. And we talk about how it's not real life. And we do these workshops, but we also do focus groups with kids and we check in with kids and we talk about what's actually going on. And it's hard to divorce porn from non-fatal strangulation. And so we talk about that a little bit as well, just that in the context of consent and in the context of working with kids who are mostly under the age of consent in New York, that makes me really nervous. And I don't want to be kink shaming for anybody. That's not what we're there to do. But it's really hard to talk about the influence of pornography without also talking about choking.
And there's the legality or illegality of child porn, which is separate from the illegality of revenge porn. And can you just split those hairs for a second?
Yeah. So you could totally be charged with child pornography under the child pornography statutes as well as revenge porn. So in New York, we talk about it as image-based abuse because it's really not porn, right? It's not done consensually for pornographic reasons. So the way that we talk about revenge porn, the way we talk about image-based abuse is intentionally sending out a photo or a video of someone else who is identifiable from the video with the intention of harming, hurting their reputation, damaging their reputation, embarrassing them. One thing that's interesting in that statute is there is something about the person being identifiable. Mm-hmm. And the way that that statute is written is quite broad. And I've heard many kids and parents ask me about no face, no case. And the way that that statute is written doesn't matter if the face is in it. If the person is identifiable from the sweatshirt that they're wearing, their hair, the background of the classroom that they're in, whatever, it's pretty broad to identify that. So that's how we talk about it in class. Even that law in New York is pretty new. And so even that is still kind of being figured out.
All right, Caitlin, now let's layer on. We've laid the foundation of porn. We've then layered on child porn. We've then layered on the complication of revenge porn. Hello, AI. I mean, help us here understand the current landscape. Can you just start there?
Yeah. So I think that the basics is that AI generated images count as explicit images. There's a new law that was just signed. I don't have all the details about that yet. But there's also in New York, AI generated images count as explicit images. I had a kid in class ask me recently, it was so eloquent. They said, as AI advances, how are we going to be able to tell an AI generated explicit images from a regular explicit image? And I said, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And I don't think anybody does. And I'm not sure that it matters, actually.
Can you help people understand the relationship, though, between AI generated images, deepfake nudes, and revenge porn? Because there's a sort of overlap reality there. And in some ways, it doesn't matter if it's, quote, real or AI. It is often used as an instrument for revenge or shame. Can you talk about what the trends are there, Caitlin?
Yeah, so there's some statistics that say that about 90% of deepfakes on the internet are pornographic, and about 99% of those just show women and girls. So it's a real issue across the internet. There are many apps that I'm not going to name them. There's many apps that do AI generated nude pictures where like maybe you have a picture from someone's Instagram page and you put it into an app and it pops out an AI generated explicit image. Sending those out count the same way as if you sent out an actual photo of someone engaging in an intimate act.
Okay, but I have a clarifying question on that because earlier in the conversation, we defined child pornography as it is pornography that involves minors, defined by each state slightly differently in terms of consent, right? And then there's the creation of it, there's the sending of it, the distribution of it, and there's the possession of it. Let's say there's a kid who is the subject of the AI generated porn or the deepfake nude. Okay. How is that child protected from being charged with participating in the creation of something? Like, to me, I fully get the distribution being illegal. I fully get the creation, even though I think these laws came to protect kids from child predators and it's all really messy and confusing. But like, that's certainly happening a lot now and is going to happen a ton in the future, right? That Vanessa can be, used to be incorporated in an AI image. And the question is, if Vanessa is under 18 or under 17 or whatever the age is, like, how is Vanessa protected from being accused of being a participant?
Right. I mean, so all of this is going to have to be figured out, right? Like, I think that there's a lot of ways where investigators can determine who makes the image, when it was made. Like, there's this redirect project that has a former FBI agent who runs it, and he's been really helpful to talk to me about how when they're investigating a case like this, they know exactly where those images go on your phone. They know that if it came from Instagram, they can see you pull it off Instagram. They can see you put it into an AI generated app. They can see you text it up, right? So there's a lot of things that can be done. Like, we're walking around with surveillance equipment in our hands every day, right? And I think the law really is not designed to go after that person who had that image sent out. And thinking about possession, I think what the law is more concerned about is possessing 35 images of 12-year-olds, right? Like of possessing something that's like more significant than just an image of yourself. Like kids ask me all the time, well, I have an image of myself on my phone. Right. And I think that, the way we always say is like, listen, your brother could see it. It could be hacked, right? Like there's potential that it can get out without you intending it. But the law is not designed to care so much about you having an image of yourself on your phone.
Caitlin, you have these conversations with kids and parents all the time. Whose anxiety is higher in these conversations? And are there ways to have these conversations that present all the information that don't increase anxiety? Because I'm sitting here listening, thinking there are so many zillions of conversations that have to be had. And I don't know how we enter them without making people feel like the world is conspiring against me and it's game over.
Thank you so much for saying that, Cara, because, one thing that we talk about at the Schools Consent Project is The internet is forever. Pictures can be saved on phones, screenshots can be taken, but that is not the end of the world. There is a way to work with these companies as best as we can to try to get those images down, get them off the internet, to rebuild. Like, we are living in a moment where things go so fast and kids' emotions are just right at the forefront. I have 2 girls in middle school. I know all about, teen emotions and everything. And I think it's about making sure that they understand that there are tools out there to assist with the consequences of anything happening, but also really to work on trying to prevent images going out when they should not be going out.
So let's talk about that for a second, because there is a really upsetting trend. There's actually an FBI investigation ongoing using thousands of teenage boys who have been the victims of sextortion over Instagram, where someone has cultivated a relationship with them online through DM, and they're convinced to send nudes. And then those nudes are used to blackmail these young men. And some of these sextortion cases have actually resulted in the death by suicide of these young people. I mean, it's just so devastating. It breaks my heart. And it has to do partially with the shame and the fear of having participated in this and feeling like there's no way out of it. And so, to Kara's question about how do we have these conversations, we must have these conversations with young people. This is not an optional exercise, people. The life and death of children, and I'm not an exaggerating person. There are kids who are being taken advantage of, and it is absolutely just a complete risk to their health, well-being, and lives. And yet, apropos of this entire conversation, we don't understand half of it. We don't understand half of what they're doing. We don't understand half of the words they're using. We don't understand half of the technology and the platforms they're on. How do we be in conversation with kids where we feel so behind on really comprehending what is happening? And our only goal is to help them think twice, hopefully not do it. And if they do, come and talk to us and know we're a safe place to come to.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that's really helpful for younger kids is parents having a real understanding of what's going on their phone, like checking the phone. There's all kinds of, I heard from parents lately where they have their entire kid's phone is also on their phone. They're available to see everything that's going on. So really having an understanding besides just talking to your kids of what is actually going on. I say to kids all the time, when all these decision makers, when we were in high school, we did not have phones in our pockets. We don't, we just live in a different world. And so checking in on that, having these open, honest conversations, it's absolutely horrific and just devastating to hear about these sextortion cases. That's something that kids ask us about every once in a while. And it's certainly something that kids are aware of. And I think just, being honest and open with them about all of that, and that they are loved, even if they send a picture out that they, maybe shouldn't have sent out, they're still loved at home. And there really are more and more ways to work around this stuff.
And we'll put in the show notes a link. I believe there's a hotline number for the FBI. I know people who've had to call this hotline number so that, because this investigation is going on across the country in different states. And I know of stories whose kids have been caught up in it and felt comfortable coming to their parents, and the parents were able to call the FBI and participate in the investigation. So we will add resources to the link in show notes.
Caitlin, if you had a magic wand and you could create rules and laws around this, what would be one law that you would put into place that sort of came state, federal, whatever, and one school accountability measure for school, or ways that schools can get through this extraordinarily common phenomenon that always seems like it's the first time it's ever happened at a school when it pops up every single year at every single school?
Yeah, I think there's way more that we can be doing around the tech companies to really encourage them to actually take images down when they say they're going to. I think some tech companies are doing a much better job than others. So definitely legislation around that, I think, would be helpful.
Any shout outs that you'd like to offer to one particular company that's doing a particularly good job?
I've heard good things about TikTok. I've heard good things about the response from TikTok. But, I think everyone probably has a long way to go to
Yeah.
really make these platforms a little bit more safer for everyone, including children. School policies, I mean, that's a whole other thing. I mean, I think just like not having phones in classrooms goes a really long way to just starting that, to just be a little bit more in real life and off your phones, I think is a good way to kind of start those conversations and start those relationships in real life, which is goes a long way.
And do you think, sort of using your legal lens, do you think that these activities that happen so often outside of school should have implications inside of school, since that's the peer group that tends to be involved, although the peer group often extends all over the globe with social media and all of that? Like, what should the role be of schools when these activities happen, sometimes within and often outside?
It's so interesting. There's a law in New Jersey that like whatever happens outside school stays outside school. Like you can't take it into effect at all. I also, from working with kids at Legal Aid, like there are kids who get suspended from school because they had sex with someone off campus. And so there's a real wide variety of that. I wish I could make a policy that would be most helpful in schools, but it's tricky because, like, as a defense attorney, it's tricky thinking about making sure that kids have the right to due process and, to have a lawyer at school suspension hearings and all of that stuff as well. But really, like, erring on the side of making sure that kids feel safe and that these are actually taken really seriously. And I think from what I'm hearing from kids is they don't always feel like they are heard from their schools.
Right. I mean, kids so often feel like parents or educators will say to them, oh, it's safe, you can come to me, or like no judgment, or if anything happens. And then there are consequences and they feel like, wait, but you told me it was okay to come to you. And I think the confusion about what the rules are and who you can go to, and, and this is not just about tech or, sexting. I mean, this is about all sorts of complicated things that happen in school or out of school, and there are consequences. Right. And truly, the best thing we can do is have these conversations openly and honestly and educate kids like you do, Caitlin, with the School Consent Project. And hopefully, beyond the scope of New York, there will be other programs like you all, so that people really have a sense both to understand what we know and also to understand what we don't yet know and where the resources might be. Caitlin, thank you so much for coming on and doing the work that you do and sharing with us. We'll link to the organization in the show notes, and however we can help amplify the work that you're doing, we would be so proud and happy to do so.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate the time that you took today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.